Harry, in the copy of the Bible I have, the English translation, at the very end of all Paul's letters comes this different letter called the Letter to the Hebrews. There's no mention of who the author is, at least in the version I have, and there's no clarity about what makes it a letter. Could you tell us a little about who you think wrote it, and is this a letter?
Yeah, the thing about Hebrews, the epistle of Paul to the Hebrews, it's probably not by Paul.
Yeah.
It's probably not an epistle, and we have no idea who the Hebrews are. So it's a bit of a mystery. It's basically a sermon that has an epistolary conclusion. So it's probably a sermon that was meant to be delivered, first of all, and then sent to another congregation. I think that's what kind of text it is. It's probably written by someone in the Pauline orbit. That is, someone who believes in the openness of the Christian message to Gentiles. And it may well be a Gentile congregation that's being addressed here. It's certainly a group of people who have some sort of interest in or some sort of understanding of the temple worship tradition of ancient Israel.
Yeah.
And they might be Jewish, but they might also be Gentiles who have an affection for that.
Yeah.
And what our author is trying to do is to address some pastoral issues that this community has. It may be a specific set of issues, it may be more general. But it has something to do with persecution.
That's what I was going to ask, what some of the general issues seem to be.
Right. In chapter 10, there's a reference to some of the things that the congregation has experienced before, some negative things. And also the concluding exhortation seems to suggest that he's trying to stiffen them up.
All right, so there's some kind of tribulation for which they need to be strengthened, but we're not very specific on what that actually was.
That's right.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly where the congregation was to which this was originally addressed. A lot of speculation that it might be in Rome. The Epistle of the Hebrews is first attested in Rome, the end of the first century, in a text called First Clement. And there's a tradition in Roman Christianity about its author, that it wasn't Paul. The people on the Greek side of the Mediterranean tended to think it could have been by Paul, but they had reservations about that. Third century church father named Origen, for instance, said the thoughts are worthy of Paul, but the style is very different, so God only knows who wrote it. But in any case, the people might have been in Rome, and they might have had some issues too with Roman authority, and there may be a kind of hidden anti-imperial agenda going on in Hebrews as well. But the main problem seems to be a kind of disaffection within the congregation, or the possibility of a disaffection might have been caused by not only external pressure but disappointment that eschatological hopes for the second coming of Jesus had not been realized.
Yeah.
So what the author is trying to do is to rev them up and to give them a sense of how important it is that they're in this congregation, that they're part of this movement, and how important it is that they be in touch with who Jesus is.
Good.
So he uses all sorts of interesting devices to do so, but that's his basic
No, that's very good. So the letter actually never claimed, the letter's sermon actually never claims to be by Paul. That's simply early tradition that it was by Paul. And the style doesn't seem very much like Paul.
Right, the style is quite different from what we get most.
So our best guess is this is another Christian who may know Paul but is not Paul.
Right, there's a reference to Timothy toward the end, and that might be the Timothy that was Paul's companion. And if so, that suggests someone in the Pauline orbit.
Yeah. What's your best guess on when this was written? I know that there are no dates included, but.
Right. Well, that text, First Clement, that seems to know it, is probably written right around the end of the first century. It's often dated to around 96. That's a bit speculative, but it gives us some sense of when Hebrews is known in Rome. So it has to have been written before that. How much earlier is a good question. It seems to presuppose a kind of second or third generation of believers. It talks, for instance, in chapter 2 about the word having been addressed to people in the past.
Right.
And so it's a likely scenario would be sometime between 60 and 90.
All right.
So after Paul's death, probably.
Probably. Okay, that's very helpful. I just wanted to go back for 1 minute to one of the things you said, because when I've tried to teach Hebrews in congregations, one of the typical speculations is, if this is written for Gentiles, why is it so full of traditions about Israel, citations from the Psalms. Would Gentiles have known all this stuff? And if not, why is our author so concerned to apply the Old Testament to his own circumstances?
If it's not addressed to a Jewish audience, it's addressed to an audience that has some sense of the significance of Scripture.
Okay.
And some experience in interpreting it. Our author certainly has that. And there are all sorts of ways in which the kinds of things he does are very much at home in a Jewish milieu. His exegesis of Scripture in chapters 3 and 4, for instance, is very midrashic. And there's also some interesting ways in which what he does, especially in chapters 9 and 10, are paralleled in Philo, a Jewish philosopher and exegete of the first century. So he definitely is coming from a Jewish environment.
Right.
Now, I think it's clear that when Gentiles were brought into the movement in the first century, if they didn't have experience in reading the Scriptures before, they were given that experience fairly early on. We see that in Paul all over the place too. He can cite Scripture when we know he's addressing Gentile audiences.
Right. He talks about their Gentile past and then throws Exodus at them.
So people were being taught these Scriptures.
Okay, no, that's very, very helpful. So let's think a little bit about how this, let's call it a homily, and we'll come back to the letter question as we go along and see where it sounds like an epistle. But I'm quite convinced that this is more like a sermon than it is like the traditional letter, and that for some reason it ends up like a letter, possibly because it's being circulated. So what is it that the writer is trying to say at the very beginning, and what are some of the rhetorical devices he uses to get the attention and the approbation of his audience?
Right. Well, he starts out with a proem, or a preface to the whole thing, that's highly rhetorical. It uses all sorts of figures of speech, assonance and alliteration, and it grabs you right away and says, look, this is really an important piece of rhetoric that you're going to be hearing. So I think it was meant to be heard. That's an important thing about
that's helpful.
Text.
Yeah.
And the way in which those devices appear here is parallel throughout the text. So he's very much engaged in a kind of spoken rhetoric here. It's clear what he wants to focus on. In verse 2, in these last days, God has spoken to us by His Son. Having spoken in the past, many in various ways, of old by the prophets, it's now by His Son. So the focus is on Jesus as Son. And what the author wants to do is to take things that people know, like, for instance, that Jesus was raised from the dead and exalted to God's right hand. That would be something that would be a widespread belief.
Right.
And he wants to invest this with a new significance and bring home to people why it's important to have that belief. He'll talk a little later on about holding fast to the confession. And so I think this is clearly not a missionary text. It's
Right. This is a congregation that's up and underway.
To people who know Christ, and he wants to say, look, I can tell you more about Him.
Very nice. And let me just try this on you, that sometimes I think when we try to understand who Jesus was in the first century, we say they had these Old Testament texts and then they looked around for somebody to fulfill them. I think I heard you say that they have this affirmation in their confession of the risen and exalted Christ, and in some ways then go back and find in the Old Testament text affirmation and elaboration of that fundamental belief. Does that seem fair?
I think that's right.
Okay.
One of the texts that they turn to in expressing their belief in the resurrection and ascension of Christ is Psalm 110, which is an old royal psalm talking about the King of Israel being enthroned, but it was taken to be a reference to Christ being enthroned in heaven.
Right.
And one of the clever things that our author does is to take that text, a portion of Psalm 110, that was never cited any place else in the New Testament, verse 4, and says we can find something new to say about Christ if we take that as our starting point. He won't get to that until chapter 5.
Right, but he's opening into it.
Right, he's opening into it. And he'll cite a bunch of texts here in chapter 1, a long chain of texts, verses 5 through 12, all of which he reads as a text pointed to Christ, whatever their original sense might have been. Starts out with another royal psalm, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," which would have been said to the King of Israel.
Let me just interrupt for a minute here, because this is another question that comes up when I try to teach this. We can look back and say this is a royal psalm, so that when God says to the King of Israel, "You are my son," part of what God is saying is, "I now declare you king." I inaugurate you. Does the author of Hebrews know this is inaugural royal stuff, or does he think immediately risen, ascended Son of God from the beginning of time?
Yeah, I think he's not thinking in the historical, critical ways that we find natural.
Okay, that would be my suspicion.
And one of the other little devices that goes on, and clearly he has a sense of Jesus, of Christ, as a pre-existent element of God's reality.
Yeah.
He says that in the opening salvo, where he talks about the Son being the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, to use the translation of the NRSV. That language, by the way, comes to him from another source in Scripture, from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, which is interesting, because there it refers to wisdom. And that's a way in which a lot of early Christians came to think about Jesus and his significance by thinking of him in terms of the divine wisdom.
Which existed from the beginning.
Existed from the beginning.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of framework that the author uses, and he'll be coming back to an incarnational framework in chapter 10. So he's not thinking only of the exaltation of Christ in Psalm 2, for instance, in verse 5, but he's thinking of the big picture. But he starts out here with the exaltation because that's going to be the key moment in what he takes to be the priestly act of Christ. And the whole sermon is about a way of thinking about Christ in priestly terms. That are also going to be terms that make him relevant for us. And that's a tricky business.
That's a very tricky business. Okay, that's very helpful. I noted in trying to work on this with you how much he kind of sets out major themes and then returns to them. So if he quotes Psalm 110 at the beginning, it may come back. That the high priest stuff weaves in and out. And so that it's much, in some ways, it's more like a symphony than like a letter. It's not, here's one thing, here's another thing, here's another thing. Here are the themes, here are the texts. Through a whole variety of applications and explications, I'll bring them around again.
Yeah, I like your image of a symphony with motifs that come in and out. And that's definitely a reality of this text. Different, for instance, from Pauline texts like 1 Corinthians, where he's dealing in a kind of linear fashion with a bunch of issues. Yeah. No, this is very carefully stitched together, woven together in a kind of tapestry of images that hang together in the end in an interesting way.
Oh, that's very helpful. What about this stuff about angels? Talks about that God has talked to the Son in a way God has never talked to angels. Is that a big issue, or is that a rhetorical flourish? Or
I see it as more of a rhetorical flourish than an issue. Some people have tried to argue that there was a congregation here that took angels much too seriously, and he was trying to wean them off of that kind of piety. And people cite things like the Epistle to the Colossians as a parallel. But no, I think what's going on here is a rhetorical move. And what the author does in the first several chapters is to set up comparisons between Jesus and someone else, someone or something else that's valuable from the Hebrew Bible tradition. So he starts with angels, in part because they mentioned in some of these Psalms. Goes on to Moses, throws a gesture toward Joshua, and then finally gets to Melchizedek, Aaron and Melchizedek, so the whole priestly stuff. And the device that's being used here is something that the Greeks call synkresis, or comparison. And it was something that you often did if you were singing the praises of someone in a bit of encomiastic rhetoric, which I think is a close analogy here.
Angels are good, Son is better, Moses good, Jesus better. Melchizedek, splendid, but we can outdo that. Mysteriously splendid, yes. Okay, very helpful. All right, so we start with the Psalm 110, then as we move into chapter 2, he's concerned that people are fading from their original faith, and then comes up with another psalm.
So the scriptural catena begins with Psalm 2 in verse 5, ends with Psalm 110 in verse 13, and some other psalms in between that can be construed as referring to the exaltation, the enthronement of Christ. And then after a bit of a warning in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, the first of several warning passages that pop up throughout the text. So the author uses both carrot and stick when he's trying to rev up the faith of this congregation. In any case, he turns to another psalm, Psalm 8, translated in the NRSV, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, or mortals that you care for them? You have made them for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned them with glory and honor.
Just for a quick word, don't you think the old King James helps us with this? Because I know why the NRSV does this. They want to use inclusive language, which is a really fine thing to do pastorally. But let me just give you the King James here. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you have visited him?
Right. Son of Man is the key thing there.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think the author knows the tradition of Jesus referring to himself as Son of Man. And that's the warrant for reading this text, not as a general statement about humanity, but as the story of Jesus in a nutshell. And all of chapter 2 is about that story, especially in its reference to the Incarnation. The human Jesus is in focus. If chapter 1 focuses on the exalted Jesus after the resurrection, chapter 2 focuses on Jesus in his days of flesh and blood. And he's going to be coming back to that notion of flesh and blood.
Right.
And it's interesting that we hear the voice of Jesus here in chapter 2. We hear it here, and we hear it again in chapter 10 at two very crucial points. And the voice of Jesus is always the voice of the Old Testament.
Right.
So we have Isaiah and the Psalms being quoted in verse 12. I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. Again, inclusive
Jesus
translation.
speaking.
Right.
Yeah.
In the midst of the congregation. Congregation is ecclesia, the church.
Yeah.
I will praise you. And I will put Jesus, will put my trust in him. Here I am and the children whom God has given me.
Yeah.
This encapsulates one of the important rhetorical moves that Hebrews makes altogether. That is, putting Jesus as the model for a life of faith.
Yeah.
And here Jesus is telling us, through the words of the Old Testament, that that's what he is, a model for a life of faith. And the author uses an image to convey that in chapter 2, verse 10, where he talks about Jesus as the pioneer of their salvation. Greek word archegos, the one who leads the way.
Yeah.
And kind of a Joshua figure. Jesus,
I think so.
Joshua is a
through
play
the
going
promised
on here.
land and into the promised land.
But Jesus as the archetype of faith is an important notion for Hebrews.
And the kind of combination of the sonship of Jesus with the childrenship of the believers as well, that somehow through him we come into the family of God as well. The believers come into the family of God as well. And therefore, our elder brother has to be like us.
That's
right?
an important conceit.
Yeah,
And there's one other thing, another bit of family language that's going to come back a little later. And this is one of those themes you were talking about that pops up early and then weaves in. The author uses the notion of inheritance. Does so in chapter 1, verse 4. Talks about Jesus having inherited a name.
Yeah, better name,
qua son.
Yeah.
But Jesus is also going to be someone who passes on an inheritance to the other children.
Very nice.
And we'll see how that works in chapter 10.
And we get the first hints of the sacrifice of atonement before we come to the end of our chapter 2. We'll see where that goes, but any opening salvos on that one?
Yeah. So the death of Christ was often understood to be some sort of sacrificial act by early Christians. Paul refers to it in Romans that way, and refers to it in using different sacrificial images and metaphors. The Passover sacrifice, for instance. Paul uses the language of the mercy seat, the hilasterion, in Romans 3. Which is kind of obscured in the NRSV translation.
Right.
And that's going to be the critical thing in the image of the high priest's action in Hebrews. We'll be getting back to that in a little bit.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
Yep.